Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Nicolaides, CEO of Bridge Housing. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's first plenary session, Housing to the Rescue. Now, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land we are all meeting on. I'm on Gadigal land, and I extend my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the many lands that you are joining us from this afternoon. So before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge our session sponsors, which is Homes North, a community housing provider operating in northern New South Wales, and all our conference partners for the generous support of the Community Housing 2021. Thank you all. Thank you to all of you. Now, I'll just make some introductory remarks. Now, clearly, housing plays a critical role in our economy and society as essential shelter, a consumer good, an investment asset, and as part of our social infrastructure. The way we think about housing has shifted again during COVID-19 pandemic, and we see the recognition of housing both as a human right and also a public health and safety response. Now, the response of state governments has been variable. Most have provided much needed temporary accommodation to rough sleepers across Australia, but the pandemic has highlighted that there are hundreds of thousands of people and families throughout Australia that do not have access to safe and secure and affordable housing. And I think it reminds us that while we're all experiencing the effects of COVID-19, its impacts fall unevenly. And with that, I'm sure that you can agree that we can and must do more as a society to deliver more social and affordable housing. Now, this afternoon's session, Housing to the Rescue, aims to highlight the value of social and affordable housing stimulus measures to drive economic recovery from COVID-19 pandemic into 2021 and beyond. And the delivery of significant new social and affordable housing supply to meet the needs of New South Wales population clearly is not simply a state government responsibility. However, they play a critical part. It requires long-term funding, investment, sustained vision and commitment from a diverse range of stakeholders, which includes the federal government, the community housing sector, local government, and of course the private sector. Now, if we get this right, in one respect, if we can build back good, then we can deliver significant economic and social outcomes for our tenants, communities, and governments, and deliver on our governance objectives. So I'm delighted to be facilitating this panel, and I'm joined by four both expert and stellar speakers. So we have Deborah Brill, Al Pawson, Angela Jackson, and Andrew McNulty, whose work across the New South Wales government, academia, community housing sector, and economic impact analysis, respectively, were well known to you all. So I'm not going to go into the bios. The biographies are available for you to read on the conference website. So with that, I'll move to the first speaker, who's Deborah Brill. And Deborah is Deputy CEO, Policy, Innovation and Strategy at the New South Wales Land and Housing Corporation. So welcome, Deborah.
Thanks, John, and hi, everyone. I'm joining the conference today from Gadigal land as well, and wish to pay my respects to the custodians and elders past, present and emerging. This session focuses on housing to the rescue, and the question I've been asking myself a lot since starting with LAC almost 2 years ago is, how do we rescue a social housing system that has long-standing and deep-seated systemic issues that need to be resolved? The rescue sits with all of us in this virtual room, bringing our expertise, passion and desire to make a difference, and using the levers we have personally and as part of the organisations we work for. And the answer can only be rescue through partnerships. I've been asked to talk about some of the state government initiatives during COVID, the work Land and Housing Corp is doing, and Housing 2041. The Land and Housing Corporation, the 2019 machinery of government changes allowed a singular focus on government's social obligation to deliver new social housing and the partnerships required for that. This focus allowed us to demonstrate to government our ability to deliver stimulus initiatives during COVID, resulting in 3,000 new jobs, the upgrade and maintenance of thousands of social homes, and more keys indoors. The state invested $900 million in the November budget, including $400 million to accelerate about 1,200 new social homes across New South Wales and 1,500 new residential lots for private sales at the Claymore and Ayers Bradbury estates, $1.5 million to provide temporary housing at the Arncliffe estate. So 135 people now have a safe place to call home. And I'd really like to call out Ol's housing role in working with Land and Housing and DCJ on delivering that temporary housing really very quickly. The funding also included $10 million cadetship program, which is being delivered by CHIA and will see 100 cadets supported to complete a Certificate 4 in social housing while working for 12 months at a mainstream or Aboriginal community housing provider. So far, there are 17 CHPs providing employment for 22 cadets. There was also $40 million distributed to 31 CHPs to upgrade LAC-owned properties. These CHPs carried out works on over 2,000 properties across the state in only 20 weeks. And it's a stellar example of what government and CHPs working together can deliver. Importantly, that program gave us the metrics and the evidence the sector can deliver in short time frames. And you shouldn't underestimate the difference that makes for us to be able to mount a case for providing more funding to be flowed through to the sector if the opportunity arises. The development of 2041 began before the pandemic. In fact, it began before 2019. Since then, this importance of a safe and secure home has become even more tangible and the problem even more real across New South Wales. The strategy considers all types and tenures across the housing spectrum, from crisis, social and affordable, through to home ownership. It also calls out that government will not achieve its vision without successful partnerships with industry, council and the NGO sector. So how does LACS work and what we are doing fit into strategy? It's not widely understood that LAC is self-funded and its portfolio is highly constrained. We often say self-funded quite quickly and then we move on, but the reality is to build any new social housing or to fund or co-fund any, LAC needs to sell houses. As our occupancy rate runs at about 98%, the simple fact is there aren't a lot of houses to sell, and as a consequence our development opportunities and our partnerships are constrained. The stimulus funds were really welcome, but they were provided in exceptional circumstances. The small amount of funding we get from the NAHA repays a long-standing Commonwealth debt. So what this means is if we're going to partner with you and others through a financial contribution, we need to sell houses to do that. That's why we've had a focus over the last 2 years on developing policies which will support the community housing sector to have certainty of income by introducing 20-year leases, redevelopment opportunities on LAC land they already manage, and support for financing or refinancing through NIFIC or other financial institutions. Over the last 2 years, we've also worked hard to get the LAC house in order. We've been building our website and our social media profiles, so we're telling you and others what we're doing and the ways we're able to partner with you. Our portfolio strategy sets out our 20-year vision and priorities to improve our financial sustainability in order to deliver more keys indoors. This strategy includes partnering more and more often with mainstream and Aboriginal CHPs and renewing older properties to reduce maintenance costs. The policies relevant to CHPs partnering with LAC and a copy of the portfolio strategy are on our website if you want to read them in detail. We encourage and invite you to put forward any strategic proposals where we may be able to work together in the confines of both of our businesses. Through a pandemic and with the changes to run the way we do business, in the last financial year, we delivered 408 new homes across metropolitan and regional New South Wales. This is more than double what was delivered the year before, and we're looking at doubling the figure this year. But that's nowhere near enough. We need to do more, and we can't do it alone. Making an impact on housing affordability and delivering more keys indoors requires collaboration across all levels of government, the community housing sector, and the private industry. The great work you've achieved today showcases what the sector can do and positions you well for future opportunities. LAC looks forward to continuing our strong and effective relationship with the sector and seeing what other innovative partnerships we can collaborate on to deliver social and economic benefits together. Thanks, John.
Thank you, Deborah, and I think that was a really useful insight into at least the both the constraints and the opportunities available to us. And that's a great segue to Hal Pawson, who's our next speaker. And Hal is Associate Professor at the City Futures Institute, and he'll outline a case for investment in social housing. Over to you, Hal.
Thank you, John, and thanks for the invitation to CHIA. I'm just going to very quickly spin. I expect most people on the call are very familiar with and can articulate themselves, but here's my take on what's the argument, what are the short arguments for why we actually need to invest in social housing. And I think this is a good place to start, because this is showing a comparison between the growth of population and the change in the size of the social housing stock over the last decade, more or less, in state by state. So sadly, in every state except Tasmania, population growth has been proportionately greater than than increased social housing. So what that means is that the proportion of social housing in the whole housing stock has been falling in every state except Tasmania. And if we look at that in a slightly different way, look at the construction of social housing over that period, comparing New South Wales, which is in red, and Australia as a whole, which is in blue, which is on the right-hand scale. The pattern is one which is dictated by money, and the very healthy number that was taking place in around 2008 to 10 was the result of the last recession, which prompted a stimulus funding package from the federal government, and then that pretty quickly tailed off after that, both in New South Wales and nationally. There was a small recovery in the middle of that sort of subsequent period that I would guess most likely represented the New South Wales government reinvesting proceeds from selling Millers Point and Sirius. But we've now gone, that's all spent, and we're going down to a level which is even below what it was in 2008. So it's a pretty depressing pattern that we've seen recently. But how much social housing do we actually need? This is a very difficult question to answer. There are many different ways of trying to answer it. We know that the proportion of all housing, which is social housing in Australia, has dropped from about over 6% to about 4% in the last 20-25 years. The OECD average is one sort of benchmark, which is 7.1% at the moment. So that's the average of all the countries in that group. High-income countries, and we can also look at research-based estimates to work out in some way how much social housing we need, calculated in a bottom-up way. And there are many different ways to do that, but there are a couple of different Ahuri-Fana reports using different methodologies, and they both come out at about the same, showing that in fact we probably need about more than double what we have at the moment, somewhere, or around about double, somewhere around. There would be a case, there's a kind of statistical case for 8 to 9%. If we were trying to keep pace with population growth, in other words, simply trying to keep the social housing stock at 4%, we'd need to build 15,000 a year. Actually, we're building less than 3,000. Maybe the 15,000 number isn't any longer quite as robust as it was before March 2020, because that's assuming population growth at the rate it was going before the pandemic, and maybe we're never going to get back to that, who knows. However, 15,000 and less than 3,000 is a huge difference. So what we're doing at the moment is we're heading towards 3% of total stock. So what's happened as a result of the pandemic and the short-lived recession that took place last year? Some states and territories, and indeed some neighbouring countries, have made quite big, and in the case of Victoria, definitely unprecedented decisions to fund social housing from the state level. So the graph is just indicating the sort of relative size of those investments that we've seen announced over the last year. Fair enough, the New Zealand one was announced very near the beginning of the pandemic. They were probably planning to do it anyway, but it's quite useful as a stimulus that will help to overcome the fairly small economic reversal that took place in New Zealand. Queensland has also announced a pretty big, in fact huge for local standards, program of over the next 4 years of nearly 3 billion. Sadly, New South Wales, yes, 900 million is definitely something that the sector will be very happy to welcome, but pretty small compared to the others, unfortunately. So some of the arguments that we've been making have not yet broken through. But I think above all of this, and this kind of comes back to a point that Deborah's presentation made. Deborah was mentioning all the kind of partnerships that are essential to make progress in this area, which I completely agree with. The most important partnership, though, I don't quite know why Deborah didn't mention. The Commonwealth has to be the source of any long-term sustainable funding program. The funding, the taxation powers and the ability to print money even is something states and territories don't have, or at least nothing like to the extent that the Commonwealth does. So, final slide. What's the broader case, for social housing investment? I mean, I think this has got several different dimensions. Mostly, we just focus on the first one. The thing which comes to mind immediately is that this is an argument about population welfare. It's a social argument. Social housing is a crucial part of the welfare safety net that's part of the welfare state. It complements therapeutic interventions for individuals who have particular problems. And we know that statistically, it can be demonstrated that being a social housing tenant has a protective effect in terms of the risk of homelessness. But there are some bigger arguments that go beyond that. Firstly, around the housing system itself. And we have a very unbalanced housing system in Australia, and building more social housing is a means of relieving pressure at the bottom end of the private rental market by taking away some of that demand, which is pushing up rents to levels that a lot of people can't afford. Secondly, it can form a vehicle for design, construction, management, innovations. It's part of the system which government can have much more influence over than the private market. And that's potentially a useful thing that, again, could serve the whole system. And finally, there are also some big economic and financial arguments that recently myself and my colleagues have been trying to bring more to the fore in a series of reports. We're talking about the cost savings to key government budgets. Justice and health in particular can benefit from savings if social housing intervenes and prevents problems from occurring. There's a counter-cyclical component of housing construction activity, even if you maintain it at a flat level, but on a larger scale than we have at the moment. And in the current situation, it can be an effective way of contributing to the recovery of an economy hit by a recession and a downturn in a non-inflationary way, which means that it's not the same as, for example, something like a home builder program, which certainly with hindsight has actually contributed to the housing boom that we've seen in the last few months. And I'll hand over now back to John and then to Angela. Thanks.
Thanks, Hal. And Hal was referring to the report the elephant in the room, and I suppose the elephant in the room is both state and federal governments making much more significant commitment to the delivery of social housing as part of an infrastructure package, which again brings us to Angela Jackson, our next speaker from Equity Economics. Equity Economics seems to become now the go-to consultancy firm to look at the impact of investment in social housing for various population groups. I would, Gary, I think they're great reports, and I will now pass over to Angela.
Thanks, John. Thank you very much, and thanks, Hal. And I'm very much going to go off the back, if you like, of Hal's presentation. There'll be a little bit of repetition, but we'll try and keep it to a minimum. So I guess in terms of this issue around, well, how can this investment in social housing, help the economy and help the economic recovery? It's important to take a stock take of where we are right now. We were experiencing a significant economic recovery off the back of the COVID-19 recession last year. That was fueled in part by economic stimulus from state and federal governments, and also the effects of, I guess, the boom back from the pandemic, which was a lot stronger than many of us anticipated. But we shouldn't underestimate the importance of that stimulus and the importance of government and the importance that government will have in this next phase of recovery. Because as we can see, what is happening in New South Wales now, what is happening in Victoria now, from the latest figures in terms of jobs, is having a significant economic impact. This is going to be ongoing, probably until vaccination rates are at 70 or 80%. So we're talking until the end of the year at least with this new Delta variant. So we have to start thinking again about, well, what stimulus works. We can go to a poll of economists from last year, which put right at the top social housing. 55% of economists, the top economists in Australia, was their number one stimulus measure. And the reason for that was twofold. One is that it returns really good economic return. That is, you invest $1 and you get $2.9 worth of economic benefit immediately. So it's a great stimulus measure. 9 jobs for every $1 million invested. And these are federal government figures. And then there are also obviously the long-term social and economic benefits, which I'll talk more about as well, and quantifying those. And putting it within that context, then you get something that delivers great bang for the buck in terms of the economic recovery, but it also sets you up long-term for these savings, as Hal was saying, to the health, to the justice system, increases labour market productivity, it reduces homelessness. It is a win-win-win-win, if you like, in terms of an investment from government. We did some analysis in our latest report for CHIA, which looked at getting to the OECD average. So as Hal said, there's lots of different things you can aim for here and what would be needed. And what we found was it's around 5,000 additional units a year in New South Wales. Now that might seem like a lot, particularly from the base that we're on, but as Hal pointed out, in the 2008 to 2010 economic recovery, we got up to 3,500. So it's certainly within scope of capacity of the system to build those, but it will cost. So our estimates are it's around $2.2 billion when you include land costs as well, which obviously often you don't need to include, but it's around $2.2 billion a year. It's still not a lot though. I'm not saying it's a small amount of money, but in the context of what we've been spending on COVID and COVID-19 and the recovery, it's not an insurmountable amount of money. Now that would generate each and every year, if the government did it, about $5.2 billion in economic activity, so it would support aggregate demand, and around 16,200 jobs across the economy. But there's other benefits as well. So that reduction in homelessness, we know from the Journeys Home report that it reduces the likelihood of people entering homelessness, also the likelihood of exiting homelessness. That can save money every year. The increase in productivity and participation benefits in Sydney alone, those long-term benefits can be there to be gained in terms of the economy. We know that entering public housing improves employment outcomes. So again, the economic benefits add up. And the health system as well. Again, some of these things, it's difficult to quantify, but where they have been quantified, they deliver significant health savings as well. So the benefits are across the board. And of course, it's great that they're benefiting the budgets, but what these really mean is they're benefiting people as well. So we shouldn't lose sight of that entering social housing, that going in secure housing into social and community housing benefits the individuals, and that's why you get these benefits and these economic benefits being delivered. And what about community housing? So the focus of our latest report was really to try and say to government, look, this might seem expensive, but there are also, a cheaper way of leveraging particularly Commonwealth rent assistance and also the lower costs of delivering and managing properties within the community housing sector. There's a cheaper way, and so you can actually get even a better return on your investment, around 50% higher, through going through community housing. And I think that's a really important thing for government to consider. The cost might seem large, and there are of course other options as well. And I think the Constellation project really highlights those, that there are other investment mechanisms for state governments as well to consider. But there are ways, even if you want to directly say we want you to build these houses, there are ways of making it cheaper for the state government. So in terms of what the benefits would be for the state government of delivering it through community housing, we're talking around, sorry, I've got a child screaming in the background, if that is interfering. It's around $631 million less if it's delivered exclusively through community housing, and around $316 million if it's a 50-50 split. Now, sorry, now we have a full interruption. Now, the New South Wales government has been investing, but it's clear that it isn't enough, and it certainly isn't comparable to the jurisdictions in Queensland and Victoria, and that more does need to be done, and that there is an opportunity as New South Wales comes out of this latest COVID-19 lockdown for the New South Wales government to invest more in social housing, and that doing that through community housing is a cost-effective way of potentially doing that. And that's where I'll end up and pass back to you, John. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angela. Of course, your comparison with Queensland and New South Wales gives rise to an analogy that you as a Victorian won't understand, but it's state of origin. So perhaps we can have a state of origin sort of budget allocation towards social and affordable housing. But Angela, look, thank you. That was a really great encapsulation of both the economic and social benefits, but actually doing a really lovely cost-benefit analysis without sort of losing the main theme. It's about what we're driving for enhancing the potential for individuals who are doing it really tough at the moment under COVID-19. So thank you. And with that, I will move to my colleague Andrew McNulty. Andrew is CEO of Link Wentworth Housing. So Andrew, welcome. And
thanks, John.
The view from community housing, one of our now larger community housing providers.
Thanks, John. So maybe in a way, I'm sort of trying to bring together some of the conversation. And Deb sort of outlined very eloquently some of the lack constraints and the lack deliverables, which are known to many. Al put a sort of real strong flavour around targets and what targets might look like in terms of trying to get to a balanced housing market. Sometimes I think we overanalyse, or some people do simplify that social housing should be incorporated as part of a balanced market delivery, but I think it's part of a holistic system that we need to actually make some effort to help achieve. Otherwise, you start to see it decrease, which Hal's outlined. And Angela was very thought-provoking around, the refreshing us again around economists stating that social housing was the third stimulus package outcome of a whole range of economists when they were asked last year. I wanted just to actually focus on this issue of rescue. And I've sort of brought in a bit of a COVID analogy around, I think I've only got 3 points I'd like to make. And I think we need to position each of these to get to 80% if we're actually going to make it happen. So the first one I was going to mention was achieving acceptance that social housing is essential infrastructure. The second one was positioning the CHP sector as a key part of the change required, and that picks up some of Angela's train of thoughts in terms of multiplier. And the third one is needing to be bold and really be bold in how we advocate to make this change happen. So if I sort of take them quite briefly in turn, the first one was again about essential infrastructure. And I think we've done really well about the message of infrastructure. So I've marked this as 50%, with 50% on the way to 80% in my mind's eye. But I think we're lacking the sale around it being essential, because listening to some of the speakers earlier on today, I like some of the language from Gabriel Metcalf from the Committee for Sydney, where he was outlined, if this had been acknowledged as a priority, a very, very effective and competent New South Wales government would focus and deliver. So I'm very much of the mind that this is feasible to deliver. It can't be left to LAC alone, because LAC, as Deborah's outlined, as a self-funded team within government, hasn't got that breadth of cash, and as others were saying, the need to bring in major taxation focus and prioritisation. So the two bits of it really, I think, as was set out by Angela, I completely agree, it's cost and value. I think we're painting a clear picture around cost, but not necessarily about the value. People aren't buying in the value, the value around not just the economics of the work that's created in the sector, in the marketplace for construction jobs and skilled technicians and architects, but the productivity gains, certainty in terms of counter-cyclical nature of a social and affordable housing stream, but then also what we focus on, sometimes only over-focus when maybe layers of government are more interested in the economic argument. The productivity that's given to our customers and consumers, families in terms of health, education, work and stability. So I think the whole argument here around jobs in the economy, housing security, productivity, and the subsequent leverage needs to maybe be articulated a bit more if we're going to really bring out the word essential in essential infrastructure. Because otherwise we win the argument about it being infrastructure, but it goes back to so what? We've got other priorities. The second one was just the positioning of the CHP sector as a key part of the change required and the delivery agent. And here I've marked us as around 75%. I think the work that's been done over the last 10 years in partnerships with government, the private sector, the Good Growth Alliance, which was discussed earlier today, was a great example. There's really good synergy that this can happen. And the CHPs as a conduit between the government and the private sector can mean that we can get great outcomes. Government's shown it can deliver really great outcomes. The CHPs have shown we can deliver great outcomes. The private sector has shown they're interested, providing there's clear policy and strategy that links to that. So, the track record's being developed. We've got the capability and capacity. We really just need to make sure that there is something to do. Because now we've got the systems and processes, the regulation, the governance, the scale, but we need to move into, the scale part. And the third part is about, the need to boldly advocate to make things change. And this is where I think we've got the biggest challenge. I've put us down at around 30% on this area. And again, if we're sort of moving, using the COVID analogy, to 80%, Mark from CHIA this morning talked about families in crisis that can't wait 10 years, the need to magnify our impact. And also the very joyous figure that 4,000 new homes have been delivered by the community housing sector over the last 10 years. But we collectively need to scale up with government and the private sector if we're going to make a difference and provide 5,000 homes per year. I believe we can. Where we're positioned now in terms of our boldness to advocate, the message from the economists, the messages from people internally within government, the messages from within the community housing and social sector have not been heard. Otherwise, the vast amounts of stimulus that have been issued in the economy would have been leveraged into social housing provision. So I think at the moment we've got, again, picking on something that Lauren from the Property Council said earlier, she talked about a housing-led recovery. We need to be making sure that this isn't a housing-led recovery that excludes social housing. This has to be a housing-led recovery which actually creates a paradigm shift, and that social housing becomes a fundamental part of this stimulus activity that might be required in the future. I do look at the numbers that have been talked about in New South Wales with great glee, really, in terms of the potential now to make a change. When we closed down the construction industry for 2 weeks, it was said to make $1 billion worth of negative impact on the economy per week. So whereas before we talked about hundreds of thousands or billions of dollars around social and affordable housing, now we're talking about billions. So the level of money that could come in to make a seismic change over the next 20 years could be made if it's prioritised. So I think the boldness and our clarity of our advocacy really needs to be quite crisp now, unless we get to a position where we're overlooked again, when almost everything has been funded over the last year, apart from social housing at federal level, with investment as well at scale on a New South Wales state level. pass back to you there, John.
Great. Look, thank you, Andrew. And I think Andrew really drew attention to the need for how we move forward around our advocacy and looking at both, we can do it both a cost benefit, but also looking at but really focusing on what the benefits are across the different sectors, and probably the need to have a broad-based sort of strategy where you have all players, both from the government, the community housing sector, and the private sector coming into play. And also, so I think some really important questions around the nuances of our messaging. So look, this brings us, so thank you to all the speakers. So thank you, Deborah, Hal, Angela and Andrew for your presentation. Now we'll move on to the panel discussion. So to our delegates, to the viewers, please submit any questions. I have 3 questions at the moment, which I'll come to. But I want to perhaps ask a question to all the sort of panelists, and this may be coming in from a bit from an aside. And this is really so apart from COVID, which you could argue is now one of the most significant crises that Australia has faced, is what we're also moving into through the International Climate Change Panel, is a much more significant increase in climate change. So there's now an emerging agenda around ESG, economic, social and government sort of outputs. While there are sessions in the conference around this, I'm just wondering that we are holders, both the state housing authorities and our community housing providers, of significant residential assets that need to be, in one sense, decarbonised, so they're fit for the future. So I'm just interested to get a view from sort of the panellists about how you think you could link that agenda to a reinvestment agenda back into social and community housing. Andrew.
Happy to throw in a few comments to start, John. I think we need to be really clear about layering policies and layering priorities. If we're going to get involvement from different sectors who are willing on an ESG agenda to get involved, we need to have certainty about what the players' roles are. So I think, again, the conduit for change, CHPs are a good position to deal with a myriad of different players who want to participate, but get participants to play at their strengths. So get architects and financiers and developers to play to their strengths, rather than people trying to, complicate things by setting up new structures. There's a lot of bona fide frameworks in place, so I would be really encouraging people to work off the background of the existing frameworks like CHP strengths and not compete with them.
Okay. Any comments from other speakers, panelists?
Oh, I absolutely agree with what Andrew's saying, and I think, both government, social, public housing and community housing has an opportunity to test and to pilot, and then to show how it can be scaled across the residential sector, so we can actually use our sector as a lead way of change and demonstrating environmental benefits, but also living cost benefits for the people who live in the houses.
Angela, any comment?
Yeah, look, I think the extent to which addressing climate change presents a huge market failure, and I guess investing in social housing is about addressing a market failure in the private housing market. And I think, going to the advocacy point, I think one of the issues is there is a strong view that that the private market can solve the housing needs problems of even vulnerable Australians, and that rental assistance is enough. And I think that's one of the bridges that needs still, I guess, to be crossed for a lot of the decision makers, that actually even with rent assistance, the private housing market is not providing the type of accommodation and the security of accommodation that people need. And so as we move and we move into new construction, I think again, social housing can demonstrate value and can demonstrate, the provision of housing in a way that, is carbon. Sorry? Oh, sorry, I thought I was interrupted.
That was on a random...
Random comment, sorry. I've just lost my train of thought. So yeah, look, I think there is that additional element to it. Of course, again, that will be seen positively within some decision makers and not so positively within others. But I think ticking as many boxes as you can is a good thing. And I think the reality is housing is central to pretty much everything. And so equally is going to touch on, a number of issues, and climate change is one very important one.
And Hal, any comment from you?
Yeah, thanks, John. My understanding of the ESG opportunity, if you want to call it that, is that it really comes from the desire of many financial institutions, and indeed the people that invest in those institutions, to find a place to put their money, to make the investment that is an activity that is fulfilling those E, S, and G objectives, but especially environmental objectives around energy performance. And the housing sector, and especially social housing, is in a very, very good position to be attractive for finance that is looking for that kind of home. But it isn't a solution by itself, unfortunately, is it? The attraction of it from the social landlord point of view is probably you are going to get a better interest rate if you are able to convince a financial institution that you can deliver those ESG outputs that they. So the payoff for that is, you could maybe reduce your interest rate by 0.5%. Great. It's a slight. It may, and NIFIC is already in on this, but it means possibly slightly improving on what NIFIC has been able to do so far. All excellent stuff. It's making it cheaper to borrow, but you still need. It's not a solution by itself, because government still has to be a partner in that. Has to co-fund. Otherwise, especially in terms of new housing anyway, the numbers don't stack up.
Thanks. I'll move to the questions that have come in. First question is about the New South Wales housing strategy. It talks about it being a 20-year vision. However, one of the weaknesses seems to be that given the number of people on the applicants on those housing pathways list, there's no measurable deliverables in the document, and it makes a comparison with the Scottish Housing 2040 strategic plan, which is committed to 150,000 new social and affordable housing outcomes in the same period. So, Deb, I suppose that might be a question to you.
I guess it might be. No, the housing strategy doesn't have targets in it, either for social or affordable housing or for housing supply generally. It was something that was raised during a consultation process with the discussion paper, that's what a number of areas, obviously, the community wanted to see. I think that's part of the next iteration, and the next action plan is actually enumerating some of the government's vision and deepening what that looks like and what the deliverables will be. It wasn't the right time, to be frank, to do that for the first version, but there is certainly opportunities over the next 18 years to do that with the action plans going forward.
Okay, thank you, Andrew.
I really empathise with Deborah and Lack's position around the housing policy. I think the housing policy is a great document. It's a great starting document. But one of the things that needs to happen within the strategy is it needs to set clear targets that actually can't be funded through start to get the creative minds around the country working out the best way to solve those problems. Because the problem can't be solved, or the opportunity can't be solved by government alone, as we keep saying. But it doesn't mean we should document it, as Angela was saying, and quantify and say, okay, we need to get to a position where we need to put 2 billion a year or 3 billion a year plus land. Because then we start to get a bit more creative about how we resolve things, as opposed to be constrained by our existing resources and constrained by existing approaches. And that does frustrate me, because I think, the issue is so big, going back to, again, the comments around how many people are in need and housing crisis. Unless we put some urgency to this here, and we always try to work within our existing constraints, it almost amplifies the risk that we miss the opportunity of prioritising mega stimulus money that should be directed to social housing now.
Thanks, Andrew. Hal?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to add that I think we may feel that government always shies away from targets in our area of work, and maybe that's often the case. It isn't always the case though, because it's not very long ago that the Premier, in fact, I think fairly shortly after the Premier became the Premier, she volunteered a homelessness reduction target. And that's pretty unusual in Australia. Okay, Kevin Rudd made a similar, possibly slightly rhetorical target to reduce homelessness 12 years ago, whatever, but state governments, state territory governments, tend to avoid that. So good on the current New South Wales government, because the Premier put that target in place, and it's created a discipline which was already ramping up activity, was a stimulus to activity to try to achieve that target well before the pandemic. And of course, everything's been knocked sideways by the impact of COVID on homelessness. So quite where we land up when COVID fades away, if it ever does, around in terms of that target, I'm not sure, but it's something which is a precedent even under the current government. And I think if Deborah's right that the next iteration of 2041 will contain clear objectives like that, we should look forward to seeing that.
Yes, no doubt we will look forward to seeing that. So the next question is based on the comments that Deborah made earlier about LAC being a self-funding organisation, and the only way that it can build is to sell existing properties. The question goes to, well, how sustainable is that strategy over the long term, and what else would need to be done to inject more money into the Land and Housing Corporation? Perhaps others may answer the second part of that question. Over to you.
No, obviously it's not long-term sustainable, and it's sustainable now because we balance what we're doing, and we balance the rent money going into operations and our repairs and maintenance, and the money that we get from sales going into capital, either our repairs and maintenance or our new builds. But as I said, what that gives us isn't anywhere near what the wait list looks like. What do we need for the long term? Well, I think in addition to us using our assets well and being clever about how we do that, we do need partnerships. We do need funding stream, certainty of funding stream. And we also need certainty from the planning system as well, because a lot of time and money gets spent waiting for the planning system that treats your developments as well as our developments as residential development, as opposed to social infrastructure and major infrastructure. So that's opportunities for us to change. And Hal, I know you're probably keen to talk about the Commonwealth's contribution to that as well.
And I'm not going to allow Hal to now answer because but he will have an opportunity. So just hang on there. So we've actually come to the point in time where we move into the final session. The final session of this plenary, where
here is that the status of housing within as a government priority, as an issue which is considered important. Both this is true at state. It's true in on steroids at national level, but it's true at the state level as well. I'm afraid it's not. It doesn't have the status. So I think this is a sort of a fundamental block to achieving the kind of things that people who are on this call want to see achieved. But we do have announcements like, even just today. I mean, we've got the Sydney Morning Herald's reporting today a target to generate a certain amount of cash from selling off some land and property over the next 2 or 3 years. I mean, these things come to the fore every so often. What proportion of those sales, what proportion of that land, which is the part of it which is suitable for housing, or this has residential use, is going to be earmarked for social housing? There should be a percentage requirement or expectation on that, and there's no sort of scientific way of saying what that percentage should be, but a lot of people talk about 30%. Clover Moore is, particularly in the local context, is one of the cheerleaders for that kind of that expectation. So I think that's a way that that's a sort of pitch that we ought to be making. And yeah, it does come at some cost. We can't pretend that it's free of charge, because if you put that obligation on the developer who buys those sites, then the land isn't worth as much as it was otherwise. Top dollar will be sacrificed to some extent. So there is a cost to it, but unless housing has a higher status in government as a priority, then that argument won't be won.
Okay, thanks, Hal. Angela?
Oh, thank you, John. Look, I think just back to the issue around targets and how we can frame this social housing going forward. I think drawing back to the Premier's priorities in particular, placing housing where it is so connected to so many of these issues. The Premier has priorities around reducing recidivism in terms of domestic violence, which housing is critical in terms of delivering. We know we have around educational attainment to the most disadvantaged, again critical. Like, it is across the board. So while there isn't one around social housing is one of the puzzle pieces in each of those social issues. Closing the gap where the New South Wales government has just made big commitments. Again, social housing is a critical component of that. So it's about seeing housing not as a means to itself, but about what it generates in terms of all those other outcomes that the Premier has outlined. That she won't be able to meet those. She might not be able to meet her COVID targets either, but she definitely won't be able to meet those unless there is a greater investment and commitment to social housing. The point about the reinvestment too, I think, is one of the critical things around disadvantage that I think we need to do a lot more about. Is what social housing really does is it keeps people connected as well to their communities, and that's obviously what community housing does, and how critical that is. And if you are selling up in high value areas and moving people to other areas, you're disassociating them from those communities and that support, and that makes the whole job of getting a job and breaking down those cycles of disadvantage much harder. And so we need to, I think, resist that as much as possible. One of the benefits of social housing is, unlike the private rental market, is it does house people in their communities, and that needs to be maintained for the benefits, for those broader benefits as well, to be maintained. But that's
and Andrew.
Thanks, John. I mean, I'd probably just very positively start, that the New South Wales government is stealing something from Gabrielle Metcalfe earlier. It's a very competent government with things it chooses to prioritise and deliver. So I think it's that boldness of advocacy. We've got an opportunity. We have maybe got once in a 20-year opportunity to get this prioritised, to get the essential into social housing as an infrastructure, so that we have some legacy funding coming in which could start stimulating a pipeline of 5,000 homes per year. So I think getting the advocacy right over the next 2 or 3 months to make sure that we try and get the message sold to a federal government and a state government that, you know, the money coming through from stimulus, which will have to kick in, does come into social housing. And then on the lower hanging fruit, I'd probably throw in, at a state level, we probably need to start looking at title transfer, because picking up the environmental issue, it's not just about new supply. A lot of the existing supply, which is so important in New South Wales, is in flood zone areas or at risk of sea level rises or in bushfire areas. So not just we need to build more homes, there needs to be a massive investment in the renewal of those homes. And there's a lot of willing participants to work hand in glove with government on that. But it does require maybe a bit more creativity around title transfer.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. And Deborah, last but not least.
And John, I get to talk about title transfer and you didn't even raise it as an issue. For those of you who don't know, this is often a topic of conversation between John and I. Look, and I think I'll cover off on advocacy and partnerships. And Andrew, your comment on advocacy really resonated for me, because I think perhaps what the sector doesn't see and, you know, isn't privy to is the amount of advocacy that housing agencies and other agencies do inside government to our colleagues and to our ministers. But, you know, bureaucrats get traction so far, and you as community housing providers add a huge other really important layer to advocacy, both as an industry through CHIA, but also through your local MPs and your federal MPs. And I'd really encourage you to think about that, because the people stories you can tell are really powerful and worthy of you using. In terms of partnership, I'll reiterate the comment I made, you know, while I was talking. You know, there are partnership opportunities available. LAC does have land that can be used. We have sought small scale but also larger scale partnerships recently at the Tolland Estate in Wagga and the Argyle Estate at Coffs. We're trying to look at different ways of doing things where we can partner with the sector, and we are really genuinely keen to continue to do that, so we can you know, lever off all of the strengths in the housing system.
Okay, look, and Deborah, thank you. And I think you make the very difficult point that the sector needs to understand its own ability to go out and advocate, that when policy is not pure policy, there's the art of politics and policy, and sometimes it's what did Bismarck say, you don't want to see how the sausage is made, but the advocacy piece is very critical here, and given the community housing providers are embedded in communities, they've got a lot of leverage with their local MPs that can help create a different political discourse around social and affordable housing. Andrew, I can't allow you any time because we're now running out of time. So look, I would just like to express my thanks to our speakers, to Deborah, Hal, Angela and Andrew for sharing their insights and frankness and their expertise today, and to the audience for your great questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them. We'll now break for 15 minutes before moving to the second and final hour of this afternoon's plenary housing, what I'm sure will be a fascinating discussion. So please join us at 4 p.m. So thanks a lot. Cheers.